Let's uncover one of history's biggest secrets. What if I told you that in the Middle Ages, the happiest, richest, and most powerful people were often women who chose on purpose to live without men? They weren't sad single women or lonely widows, but smart businesswomen who said no to marriage and built their own fortunes instead. Here's the shocking part. They were so successful that society back then literally tried to wipe them from the history books. Tonight, we bring their stories back. I hope these forgotten stories truly interest you. Now, let's turn down the lights and go back 700 years to meet women who would make today's business owners look like beginners. Picture this: London, 1287. You're walking through a busy market and you see something amazing. The best market stall isn't run by a big, strong man. It's run by a sharp-eyed woman named Marjorie de Clare. She owns 3 shops, 2 houses, and just made a deal to bring in French wine worth more than most rich nobles make in a year. And here's the amazing part: she was never married, had no plans to be, and according to court records, she was living her most excellent life. Yes, that's a real quote from a 700-year-old legal paper. But wait, it gets better. Marjorie wasn't a rare case in London. City records show that 23% of all merchants who owned property were unmarried women. That's almost 1 in 4 successful businesses run by women who chose to be independent instead of getting married. We know these numbers from the old records of London's trade groups, which are kept safely in the British National Archives. Now, here's where this story becomes truly amazing. These women had a legal name called femme sole, which literally means woman alone. But this wasn't a name to feel sorry for. Oh no, this was actually a superpower. While married women legally disappeared, their property, money, and even their right to be seen in court belonged to their husbands, single women could own land, sign deals, take people to court, and travel wherever they wanted. They had rights that married women could only dream of. Let me tell you about Agnes Sampson from 14th century York. This woman was basically the medieval version of a top investor. She owned a cloth-making empire in 3 countries, had over 200 people working for her. And her business letters, which somehow survived, show she had a great sense of humor. In one letter, she writes, "Marriage. I'd rather kiss a rat with the plague. My gold stays in my purse, thank you very much." But here's what will really shock you about these medieval boss ladies. They weren't lonely. They weren't desperate. Court records, personal letters, and even church papers show women who threw dinner parties, traveled a lot, had deep friendships, and lived very full lives. The Diary of Isabella de Fortibus, who owned huge amounts of land in 13th century England, describes her daily life: mornings managing her properties, afternoons studying with smart people, and evenings enjoying time with friends with music and stories. She writes, "I wake each day thankful that my choices are mine alone." Now, you might be wondering, if these women were so successful and happy, why don't we know about them? This is where the story gets darker. As these independent women became more successful and seen, the society around them started to freak out. How dare these women prove that marriage wasn't needed for women to be happy? How dare they be so good at business? How dare they be so annoyingly happy? The pushback was fast and planned. Church leaders started preaching that unmarried women were against God's plan. Legal experts wrote papers saying that women living alone were a danger to society. Even language was used as a weapon. The word spinster, which at first just meant a woman who spins wool and was a good job, slowly started to get a negative meaning. Society was literally changing the story to make female independence seem sad and wrong. But here's what I find most amazing about these medieval women. They saw right through society's tricks. In a letter from 1342, a merchant named Eleanor de Montfort wrote to her niece, "They call us unnatural because we threaten their natural order. Let them. We know the truth, that a woman's value isn't measured by the man next to her, but by the life she builds with her own hands. These women understood something that modern psychology is only now proving. True happiness comes from living by your own values, not by what society expects. They figured out that being alone doesn't mean being lonely, that being independent isn't selfish, and that choosing yourself isn't a second-best prize. It's often the grand prize. What strikes me most about their stories isn't just their business, success, or their money. It's their confidence. Writers from that time who wrote about these women often seem confused by their complete lack of shame or regret about their choices. Again and again, old stories describe unmarried women as surprisingly cheerful, very happy and strangely confident, as if being happy without a husband was some kind of miracle. But maybe the most powerful thing these women did was create networks to support each other. They made business deals with each other, shared what they had, and created what historians now call chosen families. These were groups of women who supported each other through everything, from starting a business to getting sick to growing old. The women in early Belgium and the Netherlands, who we'll meet next, took this idea and turned it into something amazing. Because what these forgotten women found out 7 centuries ago is something we're still learning today. That the most rebellious thing a woman can do isn't to find a man who makes her whole. It's to realize she was never broken in the first place. So get comfortable, because our journey is just starting. Next, we're going to the lowlands of medieval Belgium, where a group of amazing women didn't just choose to be independent. They created a whole different kind of society that was centuries ahead of its time. What the Beguines built will completely change everything you thought you knew about medieval life, female power, and what's really possible when women dare to imagine a different world. Welcome to Flanders. In the year 1230, the morning fog hangs over the cobblestones as you walk up to what looks like a small town inside the city of Bruges. But this isn't just any neighborhood. This is a beginnage, and what you're about to see will challenge everything you thought you knew about women's freedom in the Middle Ages. Here's something that will blow your mind. While the rest of Europe was still arguing about whether women had souls, the Beguines had already created the world's first feminist communities. These weren't nuns tied to religious promises, and they definitely weren't waiting for husbands. They were something totally new. Independent women who basically invented the idea of having it all, about 700 years before modern feminism was even a thought. But here's the part that historians still can't believe. By 1320, there were over 200,000 Beguines across Northern Europe. That's more people than in most medieval cities. We're talking about a movement so big that it basically created separate societies where women lived, worked, and did well completely outside of the usual marriage system. Let me tell you about Marguerite Porete, Beguine from 1250s France, who was so far ahead of her time, it's almost unreal. While most people couldn't even read, she wrote deep books about ideas that would fit right into a modern university. Her book, The Mirror of Simple Souls, talked about personal freedom and spiritual independence in ways that were so rebellious and threatening to the leaders of the time that the church authorities literally burned her at the stake. But here's what they couldn't burn: her ideas. Her writing survived and shaped spiritual thinking for centuries. The genius of the Beguine system wasn't just about one successful person. It was the whole setup. These women created something that modern social scientists call intentional communities, centuries before anyone had a name for it. Each beguinage was basically a gated community where women could live safely, work well, and grow old with grace without ever needing a man's protection or permission. And their business plan: pure genius. The Beguines took over the cloth-making business in Flanders and Germany. They didn't just make thread, they controlled the whole process from start to finish. Historical records from the Bruges City Archives show that by 1300, Beguine workshops made 60% of all the fine cloth sent out from the area. 60%. These women weren't just taking part in medieval business, they were changing it. Here's what really gets me excited about the Beguines. They solved problems that we're still dealing with today. Work-life balance. They created flexible schedules that let them work hard and also have time for quiet thought. Retirement plans. They set up support systems where younger Beguines took care of older ones. Affordable housing. They built beautiful, lasting communities that were around for centuries. One of the founders of the movement wrote in her journals about the great freedom of Beguine life. She describes waking up each morning knowing that her day was all hers. No husband to serve, no children to look after, no male relatives to obey. Her writings show someone living with a kind of joy and purpose that was almost unheard of for women back then. But maybe the most shocking thing about the Beguines was how they handled what we'd now call mixing work and life. These women weren't choosing between a career and their spirit, between being independent and being in a community, between making money and feeling fulfilled. They were having it all at the same time. A typical Beguine might spend her morning weaving the finest silk, her afternoon in deep discussion, and her evening making music with her chosen sisters. The money-making impact of the Beguines was so big that when King Philip IV of France tried to shut them down in 1312, the cloth markets almost crashed. Guild records from Ghent show that within months of the shutdown attempts, cloth production dropped by 40%. The money from exports dropped, and nearby areas started trying to steal Beguine workers with better offers. The king had to take back his policies because it turns out you can't destroy the money-making backbone of your region just because you're uncomfortable with successful women. What truly fascinates historians today is how the Beguines managed to avoid the sexism of the Middle Ages for so long. They were too useful for the economy to be shut down, too spiritual to be called heretics, and too independent to be controlled. In the usual ways, they'd found the perfect spot, rebellious enough to change their own lives, but diplomatic enough to avoid the fate of other women's movements that were crushed before they could grow. The letters between Beguines kept in various European archives show women who are not just getting by, but are doing great emotionally. They write about deep friendships, smart conversations, financial safety, and what they often call the joy of belonging to ourselves. These weren't women making the best of a bad situation. These were women who had actively chosen what they believed was the best possible life. And here's something that will give you chills. Many Beguines lived well into their 80s and 90s, which was almost a miracle for medieval times. Medical historians think that their lower stress levels, strong community support, financial independence, and freedom from the dangers of having many children helped them live so long. They weren't just living better. They were literally living longer because of their choices. The Beguines proved something that took the rest of the world centuries to accept, that women's happiness and success didn't depend on a man's approval or traditional families. They showed that with the right chances and freedoms, women could create lives that were incredibly rich and full. But as successful as the Beguines were, they were still living in a system that basically didn't want them to exist. Their story is one of smart adaptation and clever movement in a hostile world. However, some medieval women didn't need to create new communities to have enormous power. Coming up next, we're entering the shadowy world of medieval politics and business, where women who had been widowed didn't hide away in sadness. They stepped into power. The stories of these rich widows will show you just how much power a woman could have when she had both independence and an inheritance. What they did from their positions of power will leave you wondering why we ever believed medieval women were powerless. Step into the fancy rooms of 14th century Venice, where behind heavy silk curtains and golden candlesticks, some of the most powerful people in Europe are making decisions that will shape empires. But here's what will shock you. Many of these powerful people aren't the bearded merchants you'd expect. They're widows, and they're about to change everything you thought you knew about female power in the Middle Ages. Meet Caterina Cornaro, the Venetian widow who didn't just inherit money. She inherited a whole kingdom. When her husband, the king of Cyprus, died in 1473, instead of hiding away in sadness as society expected, she took his crown. For 15 years, she ruled Cyprus so well that Venetian records say she was more capable than 10 men. But here's the amazing part. She chose to give up her throne, not because she was forced to, but because she had made a deal so good that she became one of the richest people in all of Europe. Now, you might think Caterina was a rare case, but get ready to be amazed. Being a widow in the Middle Ages was actually the ultimate power-up for women. According to inheritance laws across most of Europe, when a husband died, his widow automatically got control of 1/3 to 1/2 of everything he owned. That's not just spending money we're talking about. That's land, businesses, political connections, and most importantly, complete legal independence. The Venetian state records show something truly amazing. By 1400, widows controlled about 35% of all the private wealth in Venice. 35%. These weren't just women sitting on their late husband's money. They were actively growing their businesses, starting new projects, and holding political power that made grown men shake. Let me tell you about Alessandra Strozzi, a 15th century Florentine widow whose business letters read like a top-level class in medieval business strategy. When her husband died, leaving her with 5 children and a lot of debt, society expected her to remarry quickly or lose everything. Instead, she took over the family banking business and turned it into one of Florence's most successful companies. Her letters, kept in the Florentine State Archives, show a woman who is trading money across Europe, arranging political marriages for her children, and casually lending money to nobles who desperately needed her help. But here's what really gets me excited about these medieval widow bosses. They understood power in ways that would make modern CEOs jealous. Take Margherita d'Etienne from 14th century Prato. When her merchant husband Francesco died, he left her not just his money, but his entire international trading network, from London to Constantinople. Instead of selling the business, she made it bigger. Records show that with her in charge, the d'Etienne company's profits grew by 60% within 3 years. What's truly fascinating is how these widows handled the world of politics. They couldn't have official titles or voting councils, but they had influence through what historians call soft power. They hosted fancy dinners where trade deals were made, arranged smart marriages that created political friendships, and used their money to support things that helped them. The English royal records tell us about Joan of Kent, the widow of the Black Prince, who basically ran England's foreign policy while her son Richard II was young. She didn't have an official title, but foreign diplomats knew that any big decision had to be approved by her first. Her household records, carefully kept, show spending on spy networks, secret diplomatic trips, and what can only be called medieval lobbying. Here's something that will amaze you. These powerful widows often chose to stay unmarried, even when they had many men asking. Why? Because getting married again meant giving up their hard-won independence. Under medieval law, everything a widow owned would automatically go to a new husband when they married. So these smart women looked at their choices: give up their power for a partner, or keep their freedom and rule their own lives. And they chose power. Isabella de Fortebus, who we met earlier, actually turned down marriage proposals from 3 different kings. 3 kings. Her answer to the last proposal, which is kept in the English National Archives, is absolutely fierce. I have tasted the sweet wine of independence and find I have no appetite for the bitter bread of being controlled, no matter how golden the plate it is served on. The economic impact of these rich widows was huge. In medieval England, tax records show that widows were among the biggest payers to the royal government. They paid for crusades, financed the building of cathedrals, and funded exploration trips. When King Edward III needed money for his wars in France, he didn't go to the Italian bankers first. He went to the rich widows of London, who together loaned him over 50,000 marks, equal to millions of dollars today. But perhaps the most amazing thing about these powerful widows was how they used their money to help other women. They set up funds to help poor girls get married, created business opportunities for other widows, and basically built networks of female economic power. The records of Margaret Paston, a 15th-century English widow, show regular payments to what she called her Sisterhood of Independence, a network of women supporting each other's businesses. These widows also changed charity in ways that still affect us today. Instead of just giving to the church like everyone expected, they funded education, healthcare, and what we now call social services. Francesca Pitti, a Florentine widow, set up the first known scholarship fund just for girls' education in 1456. Her contract for the fund, kept in Florence's archives, clearly states that education is the greatest gift one can give to ensure a woman's independence. The sheer boldness of these women is breathtaking. They lived in a world that officially thought they were less than men. Yet they gathered and used power that most men of their time could only dream of. They proved that when women had access to money and freedom from male control, they could not only compete in the medieval world of politics and business, they could rule it. What strikes me most about these widow business owners is their smart thinking. They understood that their power had an end date. Society was always looking for ways to bring successful women down. So they built institutions, created lasting legacies, and set up financial systems that would last longer than they did. Many of the charitable groups they created kept running for centuries, and some still exist today. These amazing women showed that being a widow wasn't a sad thing to be endured. It was a chance to be taken. They turned personal loss into public power. And in doing so, they created a plan for female independence that was centuries ahead of its time. But even as these rich widows were changing the highest levels of medieval society, something just as amazing was happening in the markets and workshops of regular towns. Because while noble widows inherited their power, there was another group of medieval women who were building their independence from the ground up, one smart business deal at a time. The stories of these medieval businesswomen, the original self-made women, will show you that female business ownership didn't begin in modern times. These guild leaders, merchants, and creators were building business empires that would make today's startup founders look like beginners. Their secrets to success in a man's world are lessons that are still surprisingly useful today. Listen closely, because you're about to hear the sound that changed medieval Europe forever. It's not the clash of swords or the ringing of church bells. It's the steady click-clack of Margery Kemp's counting beads as she adds up her daily profits. The year is 1393, and this woman from Norfolk, England, who couldn't read, has just become one of the richest self-made business owners in medieval history. And she did it all without a business degree, a mail guide, or even the ability to read her own deals. Here's what will blow your mind. Margery started with nothing but a failed marriage and a strong desire to never rely on anyone again. She started her first business, a brewery, with borrowed money and pure determination. Within 5 years, her beer was so popular that she was selling it to pubs across 3 counties. But that was just the start. She then moved into trading grain, started a travel business for religious journeys, eventually became what we'd now call a medieval investor, funding other women's new businesses. The Canterbury Cathedral archives have her business records, and they're truly amazing. By 1420, Kemp's businesses had over 300 employees, made yearly income equal to about $2 million today, and her personal wealth was as much as some minor nobles. But here's the amazing part. She couldn't read or write. She did all her business through spoken deals, memory, and what people at the time called a supernatural math ability. Now, you might think Marjorie was a one-in-a-million genius, but get ready to have your ideas shattered. Medieval trade group records show that unmarried businesswomen weren't rare. They were everywhere, and they were leading entire industries. In 14th century Paris alone, women were leaders in over 100 different trade groups, from silk making to goldsmithing to beer brewing. Let me introduce you to Rose of Burford, the medieval version of a tech game changer. In 1340s England, she changed the wool trade by cutting out the male middlemen and dealing directly with buyers in Flanders. Her new idea? She created the first known example of international quality control, personally promising the quality of English wool with her own seal. Merchants in Bruges would pay extra just for the Rose seal of approval. Her business plan was so successful that within 10 years, dozens of other women were copying her direct export method. But here's where these medieval businesswomen get really impressive. They weren't just successful on their own. They were creating whole support networks. The London Guild records from 1378 mention something called the Sisterhood of Commerce, a casual group of female merchants who shared market information, gave each other emergency loans, and worked together to get better deals with suppliers. Modern business schools would call this strategic networking. But these medieval women were doing it 600 years before Harvard Business School existed. The financial records of Christine de Pizan show another fascinating business plan. Besides being Europe's first professional female writer, she was also a smart business owner who understood branding before the idea had a name. She didn't just write books. She created what we'd now call a media empire. She designed her own decorated books, controlled how they were sold, and even licensed her stories to traveling performers. Her account books, kept in the National Library of France, show that she was earning more from her businesses than from her writing, making her perhaps history's first successful author business owner. Here's something that will give you chills about these medieval business experts. They were using negotiation tactics that would fit right into a modern boardroom. Take Denise Lecordier, a 14th century Parisian rope maker. When male competitors tried to sell for lower prices, she didn't get into a price war. Instead, she bought up all the best quality hemp, forcing her competitors to use weaker materials. Then she started what can only be called a medieval branding campaign, talking about how much stronger her ropes were. Within 2 years, she had gotten rid of half her competition and doubled her profits. The cleverness of these women is truly breathtaking. Matilda of Scotland, a 12th century merchant, invented what historians think was the first payment plan for luxury goods. Unable to compete with male merchants who could offer lower prices up front, she let rich customers pay for expensive silks and spices over time with interest. This new idea was so successful that it spread across medieval Europe and basically created the foundation for modern consumer credit. But perhaps the most shocking thing about these medieval businesswomen is how they handled what we'd now call work-life balance. Unlike their married peers who had to balance business with running a household and raising children, these independent women could focus completely on their businesses. The Diary of Agnes Sampson, a 14th century cloth merchant, describes her. Typical day: morning looking at accounts, midday talking with suppliers, afternoon visiting her workshops, evening planning how to grow the business. She writes, "I wake each day knowing my time is my own, my profits are my own, and my success depends on no one but myself." The number of women involved in medieval business would shock most people today. York City records from 1415 show that women owned 23% of all business properties in the city center. In medieval Cologne, the Brewers Guild was actually led by women. They controlled 78% of the city's beer production. These weren't just small family businesses either. Digs in medieval London have found large workshop areas owned by women that could produce goods on an almost factory-like scale. What truly fascinates modern historians is how these businesswomen dealt with unfair treatment. They couldn't join most male-led trade groups, so they created their own professional groups. They couldn't easily travel for business, so they developed smart networks of female agents in other cities. They couldn't get traditional loans, so they invented informal credit systems among themselves. Every problem became a chance for a new idea. The business letters between medieval female merchants show something amazing about their mindset. They didn't see themselves as victims of a man's world. They saw themselves as business owners, finding creative ways to solve market problems. A letter from Isabella Le Maire to her business partner in 1389 perfectly shows this attitude. The men may have their guilds and their laws, but we have our smarts and our will. I'd rather build my own ladder than wait for them to lower theirs. These women also understood the power of reputation in ways that modern influencers would admire. They knew that in a world where women's business skills were always questioned, they had to be not just good, but great. They had to deliver better products, be completely honest, and beat every expectation. The result? Many developed such strong, personal brands that their names became known for quality across whole regions. The financial independence these women gained was truly life-changing. They could travel where they wanted, live where they chose, and most importantly, they could say no to marriage proposals from men who might try to limit their businesses. The account books of successful medieval businesswomen often include money set aside for what they called independence insurance savings, meant to make sure they'd never need to depend on a man for money. But for all their success, these amazing business owners were living in a society that was basically suspicious of what they had achieved. The very fact that they could do so well on their own challenged the core beliefs about women's roles and abilities. And as we'll find out next, this success came with a dark price soon. Because while these businesswomen were changing business and proving their skills, society's discomfort with independent women was building towards something evil. The same qualities that made them successful: their independence, their confidence. Their refusal to follow the rules would soon become proof of something far more dangerous in the medieval mind. The link between successful women and accusations of witchcraft shows the darkest part of our story. And the great lengths society would go to control women who dared to live on their own terms. The flames crackled higher as the crowd gathered in the town square of Wurzburg, Germany, home that cold morning in 1628. But this wasn't a party or a festival. This was an execution. And the woman being burned alive wasn't a criminal or a heretic. Her crime: she was a successful businesswoman who had lived alone for over 20 years, saved a lot of money, and turned down multiple marriage proposals. Her name was Anna Hansen, and according to the trial records kept in the Wurzburg State Archives, her unnatural independence was used as the main proof that she had a deal with the devil. Here's what will chill you to the bone. Her story wasn't unique. Between 1450 and 1750, it's thought that 60,000 to 100,000 people were executed for witchcraft across Europe. Historians now believe that 80 to 85% of them were women. But here's the truly scary part that most history books leave out. A very large number of these women had one key thing in common: they lived alone by choice. The witch trial records, when studied carefully, show a pattern so clear it's shocking that it took modern historians until the 1970s to see it. Independent women, whether they were unmarried, widowed, or abandoned, were accused of witchcraft, much more often than their numbers in the population would suggest. The German historian Wolfgang Behringer's study of 16th century Bavarian witch trials found that single women were 12 times more likely to be accused than married women of the same age and social level. Let me tell you about Margaretha Hahn, whose case from the 1627 Bamberg witch trials reads like a medieval business success story turned into a nightmare. She owned a popular tavern, had a lot of savings, owned her own home, and was known for being a sharp business owner. But here's what made her dangerous to her community. She had turned down 3 marriage proposals, said she was perfectly happy living alone, and worst of all, she was heard saying that she needed no man to make her complete. The trial notes, kept in the Bamberg State Library, show the twisted thinking that led to her death. The prosecutor argued that her happiness with being single was against nature. Her business success was beyond a woman's natural ability, and her independence was proof that she must have had supernatural help. The fact that she owned property was used as proof that she had sold her soul for earthly riches. She was tortured until she confessed to having relations with demons and was burned alive in 1628. But here's where this story gets truly disturbing. The witch hunts were not just random acts of religious fear. They were planned attacks aimed at the very women we've been talking about, the independent, successful, self-ruling women who had proven that marriage wasn't needed for female happiness or success. The Malleus Maleficarum, the famous witch hunter's handbook, published in 1487, basically reads like a paranoid rant against female independence. Heinrich Kramer, one of the book's authors, literally wrote that women who live alone without a man's guidance are more likely to be influenced by the devil because they don't have the natural protection that submission to a husband provides. He argued that independent women were an insult to God's plan and that their very existence challenged the divine order. This wasn't just religious extremism. This was planned terror meant to control how women behaved. The money side of witch hunting shows something even more evil. An analysis of seized property records shows that accused witches often had a lot of assets that were taken by the authorities when they were arrested. The Wurzburg Prince Bishop Julius Ector is said to have paid for his entire cathedral renovation project with money taken from executed witches. We're not just talking about a few coins here. We're talking about businesses, properties, and wealth that represented decades of women's independent work. What absolutely horrifies modern historians is how perfectly the witch hunt succeeded. In scaring women into submission, the message was very clear. Live independently, succeed too much, refuse marriage, and you might end up tied to a stake. Documents from the time showed that many successful businesswomen started quickly arranging marriages, selling their businesses, or moving into convents, anything to avoid looking dangerously independent. The mental warfare was brilliant in its cruelty. They didn't need to execute every independent woman. They just needed to execute enough to send a message. Village records from across Germany show women giving up successful businesses, accepting bad marriages, and giving up their hard-won independence rather than risk being accused. The witch hunts effectively wiped out centuries of progress in female economic independence. But here's what makes me angriest about this historical nightmare. The qualities that marked women as potential witches were exactly the things that had made them successful. Confidence was seen as arrogance. Business skill became proof of supernatural help. Independence was seen as rebellion against God. Intelligence was seen as dangerous slyness. They literally made criminals out of the very qualities that had allowed these women to do so well. The trial of Agnes Waterhouse in 1566. England perfectly shows this twisted thinking. The prosecution's case against her included the following proof. She lived alone after her husband's death. She refused to remarry, even with good offers. She ran her own household without a man's help. And she was known to be unusually clever with numbers. Neighbors testified that she seemed remarkably happy for a woman without a husband. These weren't crimes. They were successes that had been redefined as sins. Where these persecutions happened is telling. Areas with stronger traditions of female economic independence, like the German states where women had historically been very involved in trade, saw the most intense witch hunts. On the other hand, regions where women had less economic freedom had fewer accusations. The link is so strong that some historians argue the witch hunts were basically an economic war against female independence disguised as a religious cleaning. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading the last words of these condemned women kept in court records. Many show complete confusion about their fate. Margaret Barclay, executed in Scotland in 1618, reportedly said from the stake, "I lived as my mother taught me, worked as my hands allowed me, and harmed no one." If this be witchcraft, then God help all women who dare to think for themselves. The long-term impact of the witch hunts on female psychology cannot be exaggerated. For generations after the executions ended, women were raised with the idea that too much independence, too much success, or too much happiness without a husband could be literally deadly. This mental terrorism shaped how women behaved for centuries, and helps explain why it took so long for women to get back the economic and social freedoms their medieval ancestors had achieved. The irony is devastating. The very women who had proved that female independence was not only possible but profitable were systematically destroyed by a society that couldn't handle this truth. The witch hunts didn't just kill individual women. They murdered centuries of collected knowledge about how women could live self-ruling, fulfilling lives. But even in the face of this terror, some women refused to be scared. Court records show stories of women who kept their independence despite the risks, who supported accused neighbors despite the danger, and who quietly passed down the knowledge that female freedom was both possible and valuable. Their courage in the face of systematic persecution is nothing short of heroic. The witch hunts eventually ended, but their mental legacy lasted for centuries. The fear they created that successful, independent women were somehow unnatural or dangerous became so deeply a part of European culture that echoes of it can still be heard today. Every time a successful woman is called cold or unnatural for putting her career before marriage, we're hearing whispers of that medieval terror campaign. Understanding this dark chapter helps explain why the stories of independent medieval women were so completely erased from popular history. Their very existence challenged the stories about women's natural need for male protection and guidance. Their success proved that female dependence was a social creation, not a biological need. And that truth was too dangerous to be allowed to survive. But here's what the witch hunters couldn't destroy: the basic truth that these women had discovered. They had proven that female happiness, success, and fulfillment didn't depend on male approval or traditional families. They had shown that women were capable of amazing achievements when given freedom and opportunity. No amount of fire could burn away that reality. As we continue our journey through these hidden histories, we're going to explore how society kept struggling with the problem of independent women. Because, while the witch hunts were the most extreme reaction, they weren't the only way that medieval society tried to control and limit female freedom. Language itself became a weapon, and the words we still use today carry the scars of that war of words. Words have power, and in medieval Europe, they were about to become weapons of mass mental destruction, while the witch hunts scared women with fire and torture. An even sneakier campaign was quietly changing language itself. The goal was to make sure that every word for an unmarried woman carried shame, while every word for an unmarried man suggested freedom and choice. Here's something that will make you mad. The word spinster originally had nothing to do with being unmarried. In 14th century England, it simply meant a woman who spins thread. And it was actually a good job. Spinsters were skilled workers who could support themselves, much like we call someone a carpenter or blacksmith today. But watch what happens to this innocent job title over the centuries. By the 1600s, legal papers started using spinster as the official title for any unmarried woman over 23, whether she spun thread or not. The Oxford English Dictionary shows that by 1719, the word had gotten its first negative meaning, described as a woman still unmarried. especially one beyond the usual age for marriage. Notice that small shift from a skilled worker to a woman who failed to marry on time. Here's where the word tricks get truly evil. While spinster was being turned into an insult, what was happening to similar words for men? The word bachelor comes from a medieval Latin word meaning young knight or new farmer, both words that suggested promise and potential. Unlike spinster, which became linked with failure, bachelor kept and even grew its positive meanings. The English court records from the 1500s show this double standard in action. Legal papers about property consistently call unmarried women spinsters, a word that by then suggested something was wrong with them. But unmarried men of the same age and situation were called bachelors, gentlemen, or simply merchants. Same legal status, completely different treatment with words. But the real genius of this war of words was how it put different expectations into the language itself. Let me show you something that will amaze you. Medieval law dictionaries defined these words with revealing detail. A 1581 legal book describes a spinster as a woman who has lived unmarried beyond the usual time, while defining a bachelor as a man who chooses to remain unmarried for his own reasons. Do you see the difference? Women failed to marry, while men chose not to marry. This wasn't an accident. The history of the words shows a deliberate social plan. Words for unmarried women consistently changed to suggest sadness, failure, or not being good enough. Old maid appeared in the 1520s with immediate negative meanings. On the shelf showed up in the 1600s, comparing women to unused items. Meanwhile, words for unmarried men, such as confirmed bachelor, eligible bachelor, and man about town, suggested class, choice, and being desirable. The mental impact of this use of language was damaging and lasted a long time. Court testimonies from the 1600s show women trying to defend their unmarried status beforehand, using phrases like, "though I remain a spinster through no fault of my own," or "despite my unfortunate spinsterhood." These women had taken in the shame about a life choice that just centuries earlier had been celebrated as independence and self-reliance. What's particularly sneaky is how this language shaped not just how society saw unmarried women, but how women saw themselves. The Diary of Elizabeth, an 18th century scholar, shows the mental damage. "I wake each morning reminded by the very word that describes me, spinster, that I'm considered a failure, though I've achieved more in my studies than most men I know." The money-related effects of this word shift were huge. By the 1700s, business letters show that being called a spinster could actually hurt a woman's business credibility. Customers and suppliers started to see unmarried businesswomen as possibly unstable or unsuccessful, while bachelor merchants were seen as focused and dedicated to their businesses. The same life choice led to opposite business views based completely on gender. Here's what will shock you about medieval views on unmarried men. They were actually encouraged to wait to marry to get their careers started. Church sermons from the 1400s regularly told young men to secure thy fortune before securing thy bride, while at the same time warning that women who waited to marry risked becoming burdens upon their families and objects of pity. The same behavior, putting independence and financial security first, was praised in men and condemned in women. The legal system backed up these double standards with perfect precision. English common law let unmarried men inherit property, make deals, and run businesses without any questions about their personal choices. But unmarried women, even though they had the same legal rights, faced constant questions about why they were still single. Court records showed judges regularly asking spinsters for their reasons for refusing marriage, as if their single status needed a justification. The marriage market itself worked on completely different rules for men and women. Men's value as potential husbands often went up with age and success. Older bachelors were seen as more settled and desirable partners, But women faced the opposite. Path, the same medieval papers that described 25-year-old bachelors as promising young men, described 25-year-old spinsters as approaching dangerous territory for getting married. Religious leaders played a key role in putting these double standards into moral teaching. Sermons from the medieval period consistently showed unmarried women as incomplete or spiritually lacking, while treating unmarried men as simply not yet called to the blessed state of matrimony. The language itself suggested that women needed marriage to be whole, while men were already whole beings who might choose marriage as an addition to their lives. The lasting power of these word patterns is remarkable. Even today, we can see echoes of this medieval propaganda in modern language. Bachelorette parties celebrate a woman's last moments of freedom before marriage, suggesting that marriage ends female independence. But bachelor parties celebrate a man's choice to give up his freedom for love, suggesting sacrifice rather than completion. What makes this word manipulation so effective is how quiet it is. Unlike the obvious violence of witch hunts, the war of words works without us noticing. People take in these ideas without questioning them, accepting the idea that female independence is somehow unnatural or sad, while male independence represents choice and strength. The medieval writers who recorded these word shifts seem to have known exactly what they were doing. A 1534 paper on proper Christian language clearly states that words for unmarried women should show the sadness of their incomplete state, while words for unmarried men should respect their deliberate choice to remain uncommitted. This wasn't an unconscious bias. This was a planned social program. But here's what gives me hope about this dark chapter. Some medieval women saw right through the manipulation. The letters of Lady Margaret Beaufort, who remained unmarried by choice for most of her adult life, show her purposely using positive language to describe her status. She calls herself a woman of independent means, rather than accepting the word spinster, and describes her unmarried friends as ladies of good judgment rather than old maids. The economic records of successful unmarried women also show resistance to being put down by words. Business deals from the 1500s show women like Merchant Agnes declaring themselves as Agnes, a merchant rather than Agnes, spinster, refusing to lead with their marital status in professional situations. Understanding this war of words helps explain why stories of successful, independent women were so completely erased from popular culture. The language itself had been used as a weapon to make female independence seem tragic or unnatural. When the words we use to describe unmarried women carry built-in ideas of failure or sadness, it becomes much easier to dismiss their successes and ignore their happiness. But while society was busy rewriting the dictionary to shame independent women, some of the most amazing women in medieval history were doing great behind convent walls. Not as rejected spinsters looking for a safe place, but as powerful leaders who had chosen spiritual independence over earthly marriage. Their stories show that the medieval world offered paths to female freedom that we've completely forgotten. Next, we're entering the sacred halls where some of the most powerful women in medieval Europe held power that would make modern CEOs envious. These weren't women who failed at marriage. These were women who chose something far more ambitious. What these female leaders achieved within their religious communities will change everything you thought you knew about medieval female power. Behind the tall stone walls of a French abbey in the 12th century, something amazing was happening that would make modern corporate boards look like a joke. The woman pacing the marble floors of her private rooms wasn't some quiet nun hiding from the world. She was Abbess Petronilla, and she controlled an empire that spread across 4 countries, managed assets worth millions in today's money, and had the loyalty of over 3,000 people. Oh, and she answered to no man on earth except the Pope himself. Here's what will blow your mind about medieval convents. They weren't safe places for women who couldn't find husbands. They were the Harvard business schools of their time. The only places where smart women could rise to positions of real power without a man's permission, while the outside world was busy calling unmarried women failures. Inside convent walls, these same women were running huge international organizations, handling international politics and gathering wealth that would make today's top CEOs cry with envy. Let me tell you about Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess who was so far ahead of her time that she seems almost unreal. This woman didn't just run a convent. She built an empire of ideas. She wrote symphonies that are still played today, wrote medical books that were used for centuries, and wrote to emperors and popes as an equal. And by the way, she also claimed to get visions directly from God. Her abbey's financial records, kept in the Hessen State Archives, show that with her in charge, the convent's wealth grew by 400% in 30 years. But here's where the story gets really interesting. These abbesses had powers that even kings wanted. They could kick people out of the church, give pardons, make their own money, and have their own armies. The Abbey of Quedlinburg in Germany was ruled by abbesses who had the rank of imperial princess and a seat in the imperial council. They literally had more political power than most male nobles. The economic size of these medieval convent businesses is truly huge. The Abbey of Shaftesbury in England, led by a line of powerful abbesses, owned over 100,000 acres of land, collected rent from dozens of towns, ran multiple mills and breweries, and had trade deals across Europe. The Domesday Book records show that in 1086, Shaftesbury Abbey was the second richest landowner in all of England, with only the king himself being richer. What makes these abbesses even more amazing is how they handled the politics of a man's world while keeping their independence. Take Abbess Hilda of Whitby. Wait, that's a man's name, right? Wrong. This was actually Abbess Jean de Hatchie, who on purpose used masculine titles and signatures to get more respect in political talks. Her letters with the French royal court, kept in the National Archives, show her successfully getting tax breaks, settling land disputes, and making trade deals while never telling her faraway contacts that she was a woman. Here's something that will give you chills about the intelligence of these women. They had figured out centuries before anyone else that economic independence equals political power. The account books of medieval convents read like top-level classes in smart investing. They didn't just own land. They ran banks, funded trading trips, invested in new technologies, and basically created the first venture capital networks in European history. The Abbess Herod of Landsberg created what historians consider the world's first illustrated encyclopedia, the Hortus Deliciarum, which had everything from astronomy to philosophy to practical medicine. But here's the amazing part. She didn't write it for male scholars. She created it specifically as a school text for women, proving that female brainpower was equal to or better than men's. The book, though sadly destroyed in 1870, was copied a lot and influenced education across Europe for centuries. These convent leaders also changed healthcare in ways that shaped modern medicine. The Abbey of Hôtel Dieu in Paris, run by a line of brilliant abbesses, ran the largest hospital in medieval Europe. Their medical records, kept in the public assistance archives, show survival rates that weren't matched by non-religious hospitals until the 19th century. These women were doing complex surgeries, developing new medicines, and training female doctors centuries before medical schools would let women in. But perhaps the most rebellious thing these abbesses did was prove that female leadership could be better than male leadership. Writers from the time repeatedly noted that convents run by women were more financially stable, better organized, and more innovative than male-led monasteries. A 13th century PayPal report comparing religious institutions found that female-led houses were 60% more likely to be debt-free and 40% more likely to be growing their operations. The international networks these women created would make modern multinational companies envious. Abbess Matilda of Quedlinburg kept regular letters with religious houses from Ireland to Poland, coordinating everything from copying books to financial investments. Her letters, kept in various European archives, show a woman who thought in terms of continental strategy and long-term economic planning. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how these abbesses handled what we'd now call work-life balance. Unlike the outside world, where successful women were automatically called unnatural or dangerous, inside convent walls, female ambition and intelligence were not just accepted, but celebrated as gifts from God. These women could pursue learning, art, politics, and business growth without ever having to justify their choices or defend their right to be independent. The educational innovations of these medieval abbesses were centuries ahead of their time. The Abbess Helo say, yes, the same Helo say from the famous love letters, developed what historians consider the first organized curriculum for women's higher education. Their teaching methods focused on logic, public speaking, math, and science, creating generations of educated women who would go on to influence European intellectual growth. Here's where the story gets deliciously ironic. While the outside world was burning independent women as witches, these abbesses were gathering more wealth, power, and influence than most non-religious rulers. They had found the perfect loophole in medieval sexism by framing their ambitions in religious terms. They could achieve everything that non-religious women were forbidden to try. The Abbess Matilda of Tuscany, not to be confused with the secular countess, controlled trade routes that brought in money equal to entire kingdoms. Her abbey's customs records show that she was basically running a medieval import-export business, taking a cut from merchants crossing her lands while using the profits to fund learning, arts, and more growth. She was running what we'd now call a private equity firm, except she was only accountable to God. These women also understood public relations in ways that modern politicians would admire. They consistently framed their wealth gathering and power, building as services to God and the community. It's making it nearly impossible for critics to attack them without seeming to oppose God's will. The stories of their time repeatedly describe them as blessed with unusual wisdom and favored by divine providence, language that protected them from the accusations of being unnatural that destroyed non-religious, independent women. The book collections of these abbesses show women who were genuinely happy with their choices. Their personal writings described deep satisfaction with their work, pride in their successes, and thankfulness for their independence. Unlike the sorry tone we see in the writings of non-religious spinsters, these women wrote with confidence and joy about their roles as leaders and innovators. But here's what makes their story even more remarkable. They were preparing for a future they knew was coming. Many abbesses set up funds and legal structures designed to protect female independence long after they were gone. They were building institutions that could survive changes in the political mood and social views, creating lasting legacies that would benefit women for generations. However, even as these amazing abbesses were proving female leadership skills within religious walls, the non-religious world continued to struggle with a basic question. If women could be so successful and happy living independently, why did society insist they needed husbands to be complete? The answer to this puzzle lies in understanding how medieval dating and relationships actually worked. Because while we've been exploring stories of women who chose independence, there's another side to this tale. The women who wanted love and partnership but refused to settle for relationships that would reduce their freedom. Their methods for finding equal partnerships in an unequal world show that medieval romance was far more complex and strategic than any fairy tale would have you believe. Imagine swiping, right? In 1387, the dating app is a handwritten letter carefully written by a professional writer. And the profile says, "Looking for a gentleman of good character, for smart conversation and mutual respect. Must appreciate an independent lady who owns property, speaks 3 languages, and has strong opinions about Italian poetry." Dowry can be discussed, but freedom is not for sale. This isn't made up. This is a real personal ad from the London Guild Records placed by a woman named Thomasina de Ashby. And it shows that medieval dating was far more strategic, smart, and female-led than any Hollywood movie would make you think. Here's what will shock you about medieval romance. The women who had the most dating success weren't the helpless girls waiting to be rescued. They were the independent businesswomen, the educated abbesses who left the convent, and the rich widows who knew exactly what they wanted and weren't afraid to bargain for it. These women had figured out the secret of medieval romance by understanding something that the modern world took centuries to learn. The best relationships are partnerships between equals, not rescues between unequals. Let me tell you about Marie de Montpellier, a 13th century French merchant who basically invented speed dating. Tired of time-wasting men who were more interested in her money than her mind, she set up what she called merchant salons. Regular meetings where unmarried professionals could meet, talk business, and check each other out as potential partners. Her personal letters, kept in the Montpellier Municipal Archives, describe these events with great detail. I have come up with a most effective way to judge gentlemen. They must show their wit through conversation, their character through business deals, and their respect by paying proper attention to the ladies' opinions. The success rate of Marie's system was amazing. Of the 47 couples who met at her salons between 1267 and 1275, church records show that 39 marriages happened, and, amazingly, only 3 ended in separation. A divorce rate of less than 8% in a time when many arranged marriages failed within the first 10 years. What made her system work? She insisted on what she called courtship of equals, men and women meeting as smart and economic peers rather than as chasers and the chased. But here's where medieval dating gets really innovative. These independent women developed what we'd now call compatibility testing centuries before psychology was a science. The letters of Marguerite d'Aver, a 14th century businesswoman, show a detailed screening process for potential suitors. She required interested men to show their skills at home, their money management abilities, and most importantly, their comfort with a woman in charge. One hilarious letter describes her making a suitor manage her household bills for a week to see if he could appreciate a woman's work without trying to control it. The money talks around these partnerships were very complex. Unlike traditional arranged marriages, where women were basically traded like property, these independent women negotiated prenuptial agreements that would make modern divorce lawyers proud. The Will of Agnes de la Fere, a 15th century English merchant, includes marriage deals that lay out everything from business partnership terms to household chores to rules, protecting her right to travel for business. What's truly remarkable is how these women used their economic independence as power in relationships. They could afford to be picky, to reject bad suitors, and to bargain for partnerships that made their lives better, not worse. The Diary of Isabella Andreini, a 16th century Italian merchant, captures this perfectly. I have spent 15 years building my fortune and my reputation. Any man who wants my hand must prove he will add to both, not take away from either. These medieval dating methods often included what we now call trial periods. Court records from 14th century Florence describe courtship deals, where couples would live in separate but nearby homes for a year, working together on businesses and social events to test their compatibility before getting married. It was like medieval living together, but with more legal structure and clearer ways to end it. The role of female friendship networks in medieval dating cannot be stressed enough. Independent women created smart referral systems, sharing information about suitors' reputations, financial stability, and how they treated previous partners. The letters between successful businesswomen read like early Yelp reviews, detailed reports on men's character, habits, and whether they were suitable for a partnership with an independent woman. Here's something that'll make you laugh. Medieval women developed detailed tests to judge men's attitudes toward female independence. One popular method seen in various personal letters involved purposely showing off business smarts or intelligence. Early in the courtship, to see how potential suitors reacted, women would intentionally do better than men in deals, show superior knowledge of politics or trade, or show off their financial independence to get rid of men who were threatened by capable women. The success stories that came from these strategic approaches to medieval dating are genuinely heartwarming. The marriage records of Thomas and Margaret Paston, kept in the Norfolk Record Office, show a partnership that modern couples would envy. Their letters show mutual respect, shared business decisions, intellectual teamwork, and what can only be described as real romantic love. Margaret signs her letters, "Your equal partner in all things," while Thomas calls her "my most trusted advisor and dearest companion." But perhaps the most rebellious part of medieval dating among independent women was how they redefined the very idea of romantic success. Instead of measuring success by getting any husband, these women measured it by finding partnerships that made them happier and opened up more possibilities. They were looking for what we'd now call relationship added value, connections that made their already full lives even richer. The international reach of medieval dating networks is also fascinating. Successful women often looked for partners across national borders, using trade connections and diplomatic relationships to meet suitable men from other regions. The marriage of Caterina Sforza to Giovanni de' Medici was actually arranged through a network of female merchants who had found mutual business interests and compatible personalities across Italian city-states. These women also pioneered what we'd now call lifestyle compatibility testing. They insisted on potential partners sharing their values about work, independence, and mutual respect. The marriage contract of Jacqueline de Hainaut, kept in the Belgian National Archives, includes rules requiring her husband to respect her business trips, support her charity work, and never interfere with her money decisions without being invited. What makes these medieval dating methods so impressive is how they balanced romantic desire with practical needs. These weren't cold, calculated deals. The personal letters show real affection, passion, and emotional connection. But they were also strategic partnerships between people who understood that lasting love requires mutual respect, shared values, and compatible life goals. The failure stories are just as informative. When independent women did marry men who couldn't handle their freedom, the results were often spectacular disasters that served as warnings for other women. Court records document many cases of successful businesswomen whose marriages to controlling men led to financial ruin, social isolation, and personal misery. Powerful reminders of why careful partner choice was so important. These medieval women understood something that modern dating culture is still struggling with: the difference between settling for company and holding out for a true partnership. They were willing to stay single rather than give up their hard-won independence for relationships that would make their lives smaller. Their approach to romance was both practical and idealistic. They wanted love, but only if it came with respect, equality, and mutual growth. The most successful medieval couples from this independent dating scene created what historians call power partnerships, relationships where both people brought significant assets, skills, and networks to the marriage, creating combined households that were more influential and prosperous than either could achieve alone. These weren't just marriages, they were strategic alliances that happened to include real love and affection. However, understanding how these amazing women approached romance raises a key question about the economic foundations that made their independence possible in the first place. Because behind every successful medieval dating strategy was a woman who had first mastered the art of being financially self-sufficient. Which brings us to one of the most fascinating parts of medieval female independence: the smart economic systems these women developed to build and keep their wealth. Their approaches to money management, investment, and financial planning were so advanced that they influenced European banking for centuries. The secrets of medieval women's wealth-building methods show principles that are still surprisingly useful for anyone seeking financial independence today. Follow the money, they say. And when you trace the gold coins through medieval Europe, they lead to a truly shocking discovery. Some of the continent's richest people weren't kings, weren't merchant princes, and weren't even men. They were single women who had mastered the art of medieval business so well that their financial plans would make Warren Buffett take notes. These women didn't just get rich by accident. They planned it with a precision that shows a financial intelligence centuries ahead of its time. Here's what will completely change how you think about medieval economics. Independent women were running the world's first hedge funds. Take Mahaut of Artois, a 14th-century French countess who chose to stay unmarried after her husband's death. Her financial records, kept in the departmental archives of Pas-de-Calais, show investment plans that would fit right into a modern portfolio. She spread her money across farming, manufacturing, shipping, real estate, and what can only be called medieval venture capital, funding new technologies and startup businesses across France and Flanders. The numbers are truly huge. By 1315, Mahaut's yearly income was about 80,000 livres, equal to roughly $15 million today. But here's the amazing part. She wasn't inheriting this wealth. She was creating it. Her account books showed that she took her small inheritance and multiplied it by 2,000% over 20 years through smart investments, currency trading, and what we'd now call private equity deals. Now, you might think Mahaut was some financial genius who was one of a kind, but get ready to be amazed. The Venetian tax records from 1379 show that unmarried women controlled 31% of the city's private wealth, even though they were only 8% of the adult population. That's nearly 4 times the wealth you'd expect from a random split. These women weren't just rich. They were systematically, strategically, brilliantly rich. Let me introduce you to the medieval version of a cryptocurrency pioneer, Jacoba Filizi, a 14th-century Parisian who changed medical practice by creating the first subscription-based healthcare system. Instead of charging for each visit like traditional doctors, she sold yearly health packages to rich families, promising medical care for a set fee. Her new idea was so successful that within 5 years she had over 200 subscriber families and was earning more than the official court doctors who had tried to ban her from practicing. The economic benefits of being single in the Middle Ages were huge, but you had to be smart enough to use them. Unmarried women could own property in their own names, make deals without a man's permission, and most importantly, they kept 100% of their earnings. Meanwhile, married women legally owned nothing. Every penny they earned automatically belonged to their husbands. The financial reason for staying single was so strong that some women on purpose avoided marriage, even when they had romantic relationships. Here's something that'll blow your mind about medieval financial planning. These women were creating trust funds and investment plans that worked across generations. The will of Alessandra Mascinghi Strozzi, kept in the Florentine State Archives, shows a financial setup so smart it includes international currency protection, varied real estate in 3 countries, and funds designed to support other women's business projects forever. The size of women's economic networks was truly international. Margherita Dettine, the Italian merchant we met earlier, had business relationships with suppliers in England, customers in Constantinople, and financial partners in Bruges. Her letters, miraculously kept in the Dettine archives in Prato, show a woman who was basically running a medieval multinational company, complete with foreign currency calculations, risk management plans, and market analysis that reads like a modern business school case study. But perhaps the most innovative part of medieval women's wealth building was their approach to what we'd now call social impact investing. These women consistently funded projects that would help other women while making a profit. They set up loan programs for female business owners, created scholarship funds for girls' education, and invested in technologies that would reduce housework, basically building an economy that supported female independence while making themselves richer. The property investment plans of medieval women were particularly smart. Instead of just buying land like most rich men, they focused on properties that made money in city centers. The tax records of 14th century London show that women owned 67% of all commercial rental properties in the city center. They had taken over the market on the medieval version of apartment buildings and office complexes. Here's what makes these medieval financiers even more impressive. They were working without banks, credit cards, or modern financial tools. Everything had to be done through personal relationships, written deals, and careful reputation management. The account books of successful businesswomen show detailed systems of credit, debt management, and risk assessment that required extraordinary math skills and business smarts. The investment clubs formed by rich medieval women were centuries ahead of their time. Groups of unmarried women would pool their money to fund large projects, shipping trips, manufacturing projects, and even early mining operations. The Libro di Ricordanza of Alessandra Strozzi documents one such partnership where 12 Florentine women together funded a silk trading trip to the East, sharing both risks and profits according to carefully negotiated shares. What truly fascinates modern economists is how these women handled market ups and downs. The financial crisis of 1346 to 1353, caused by Edward III's failure to pay back loans to Italian bankers, destroyed many male-led businesses. But the account books of women business owners show remarkably steady performance during this time. Why? They had spread their investments across multiple countries and industries, kept larger cash savings, and avoided the high-risk, high-leverage plans that brought down their male competitors. The currency trading done by medieval businesswomen was particularly smart. They understood that different regions used different money systems and actively traded currencies to make a profit from exchange rate changes. The records of Margaret Russell, a 15th-century English merchant, show her regularly converting between English pounds, Flemish gross, Venetian ducats, and Florentine florins, making profits on the difference while also protecting against currency losing value. These women also pioneered what we'd now call lifestyle business models, businesses designed to make enough money to support their desired way of life while maximizing personal freedom. Unlike male business owners who often pursued growth for its own sake, successful women typically aimed for stability, flexibility, and a good work-life balance. The retirement planning of medieval women was remarkably forward-thinking. They consistently set aside larger parts of their income for old age than their male peers, understanding that they couldn't rely on children or male relatives for support. The Will of Agnes Paston from 1479 shows a woman who had saved enough wealth to live comfortably for 30 years without earning any more money. But here's what really sets these medieval women apart. They understood that wealth without freedom was meaningless. They consistently chose financial plans that kept their independence and decision-making power. Even when other ways might have been more profitable, they would rather earn less money as free individuals than earn more as dependent wives or business partners. The charitable giving patterns of rich medieval women also show smart financial thinking. Instead of making large one-time donations like most rich men, they created funds and trusts designed to provide ongoing support for causes they cared about. They were basically creating the first impact investment funds, creating social returns alongside financial ones. What strikes me most about these medieval financial plans is how they balanced aggressive wealth building with careful risk management. These women understood that their economic independence was fragile. Social views could change, laws could be changed, or political problems could threaten their position. So, they built financial fortresses designed to survive any storm. The record-keeping systems developed by successful businesswomen were very detailed and organized. They had to be because, unlike men who could rely on guild protections or family support, women's business success depended completely on their ability to prove their skill and reliability. Their account books read like monuments to female analytical intelligence. However, all this financial success raises a fascinating question. If medieval women could achieve such amazing economic independence and success, why weren't there more of them? The answer lies in understanding not just the opportunities available to special women, but the amazing individuals who took those opportunities. Because while we've explored the systems and plans that made female independence possible, we haven't yet met the specific women who became legends. The stories of the most famous medieval spinsters show personalities so interesting and achievements so amazing that they challenge everything we think we know about what was possible for women in the medieval world. Meet the medieval woman who literally changed the course of KSE. Ruby Kiss, the course of European history without ever wearing a wedding ring. Her name was Christine de Pizan. In 1405, she published something so rebellious that it's still influencing feminist thinking today. The Book of the City of Ladies is probably the world's first feminist book. But here's what makes her story truly amazing. She wasn't some rich lady with endless money. She was a single mother of 3 who became Europe's first professional female writer by pure force of will, smart planning, and a complete refusal to accept society's limits. Here's what will completely blow your mind about Christine. When her husband died in 1389, leaving her with debts, 3 children, and a mother to support, society expected her to remarry quickly or face poverty. Instead, she picked up a pen and literally wrote her way to financial independence. Within 5 years, she was earning enough from her writing to support her whole family, buy property, and even hire writers and illustrators. The financial records from the French Royal Library show that by 1410, she was one of the highest-paid authors in all of Europe, male or female. But Christine wasn't just making money from her writing. She was using it to fight a war of ideas against medieval sexism. Her City of Ladies systematically tore down every argument used to say women were less than men, using examples of smart women throughout history to prove that female brainpower equaled or surpassed men's. The book copies that survive now, spread across European libraries, show that her work was being read from England to Italy, completely changing how a whole continent thought about women's abilities. Now, let me introduce you to someone even bolder. Joan of Arc, the ultimate medieval spinster who never married because she was too busy saving France. But here's what most people don't realize about Joan. She wasn't just a religious visionary or military leader. The court records from her trials, kept in the National Archives of France, show a woman who was also a brilliant political planner and negotiator, who consistently outsmarted the most experienced male diplomats of her time. What's truly fascinating about Joan is how she used her unmarried status as a political advantage. When English propagandists tried to discredit her by calling her an unnatural woman for refusing marriage, she turned it around, declaring that she was married to France itself and that no earthly husband could compete with her divine mission. The trial notes show her repeatedly using her singleness as proof of her spiritual purity and political independence. She had turned society's criticism into her greatest strength. The financial independence of these famous medieval spinsters was often the foundation of their other achievements. Take Margery Kempe, the English business owner we met earlier. Her business success wasn't just about making money. It funded her spiritual trips across Europe and the Middle East, journeys that would have been impossible for a dependent wife. Her autobiography, the first in English by a woman, describes using her wealth to buy the freedom to follow her calling. Whether that was pilgrimage, mystical experience, or simply the right to live by her own rules. Here's something that'll give you chills about these remarkable women. They all understood that their unmarried status was actually a superpower that taught them to do things that would have been impossible as wives. Hildegard of Bingen, the abbess, composer, and philosopher we talked about earlier, explicitly wrote about how her freedom from earthly marriage allowed her to develop her marriage to divine wisdom. Her musical compositions, scientific books, and theological works represent one of the most complete intellectual achievements of the entire medieval period. The international influence of these famous spinsters is huge. Christine de Pizan's works were translated into multiple languages and influenced female scholars across Europe. The University of Bologna Library has manuscripts showing that her ideas about female education were being discussed in Italian universities by 1420. Her idea of women's intellectual equality was literally reshaping European academic thought, one university at a time. But perhaps the most rebellious thing these women did was show that female fulfillment didn't require a man's validation. Their writings, kept across various European archives, consistently describe lives of deep satisfaction, intellectual excitement, and spiritual richness. They weren't apologizing for their unmarried state. They were celebrating it as the choice that made their amazing achievements possible. The artistic innovations of these medieval spinsters were often directly connected to their independence. Herod of Landsberg's Garden of Delights, the illustrated encyclopedia we talked about earlier, could only have been created by someone with complete control over their time and money. The manuscript required years of dedicated work, a lot of research, and a significant financial investment in materials and writers. A wife and mother simply wouldn't have had the freedom to take on such an ambitious project. What strikes me most about these famous women is how they created entirely new categories of female achievement. Before Christine de Pizan, there was no such thing as a professional female author. Before Joan of Arc, no one imagined that an unmarried peasant girl could lead armies and crown kings. Before Hildegard, no woman had combined scientific study with musical composition and mystical theology. These women weren't just successful within existing systems, they were creating new systems that expanded what was possible for all women. The letters between these remarkable spinsters show smart networks of mutual support and intellectual exchange. Letters kept in various European libraries show Christine de Pizan writing to other learned women, sharing ideas, manuscripts, and plans for navigating their unusual positions in society. They were creating what we'd now call a community of practice for independent medieval women. The economic plans of these famous women were often as innovative as their other achievements. Joan of Arc negotiated payment for her military services, ensuring her family's financial security even while on her mission. Christine de Pizan developed multiple income sources from her writing, including direct commissions, book sales, and what were basically speaking fees for public readings. They understood that financial independence was the foundation that made all their other freedoms possible. Here's what makes these medieval celebrities even more impressive. They achieved their fame and influence without any of the support systems that modern successful women take for granted. No agents, no publicists, no marketing departments, no social media platforms. Everything they accomplished was through personal relationships, word of mouth, reputation, and the sheer quality of their work. The legacy of these famous spinsters went far beyond their individual achievements. They created templates that other women could follow, proving that alternatives to traditional marriage and motherhood were not just possible, but potentially glorious. Their examples gave courage to countless other women who might otherwise have accepted conventional limits. The writings of these women also show something beautiful. They weren't bitter about their unmarried status or resentful of women who chose differently. Their works consistently showed gratitude for their independence and respect for women who found fulfillment in marriage and family. They understood that the goal wasn't to condemn marriage, but to expand options to make female choice rather than female destiny the deciding factor in women's lives. What's particularly moving about these medieval spinsters is how they saw their legacy. Many explicitly wrote about hoping their achievements would inspire future generations of women to follow their own paths. Christine de Pizan, in particular, wrote about creating pathways for my daughter's daughters. She was consciously working to expand possibilities for women she would never meet. The international recognition these women achieved during their lifetimes was extraordinary. Christine's works were commissioned by royal courts across Europe. Joan's military reputation spread to England, where she was both feared and admired. Hildegard's compositions were played in cathedrals from Ireland to Poland. They had achieved what we'd now call global celebrity centuries before mass communication existed. However, understanding the individual wins of these remarkable women raises a deep question about the nature of happiness itself. Because while these famous spinsters achieved extraordinary success and recognition, what about the ordinary women who chose independence without seeking fame or changing history? Were the countless unknown women who lived quietly free lives, genuinely happy with their choices? The question of whether medieval spinsters were truly happy or just making the best of a tough situation takes us to the heart of one of history's most lasting myths. The evidence about the emotional lives of unmarried medieval women will challenge everything you think you know about the relationship between marriage and female happiness. Open any medieval book showing unmarried women, and you'll see them portrayed with sad eyes, hands clasped in prayer, surrounded by signs of sadness and regret. These illustrated books, made by male writers and artists, tell a story of sadness and spiritual emptiness that has shaped our understanding of medieval spinsters for centuries. But here's the thing that will completely shatter this story. When you read the actual words written by these women themselves, their personal letters, diaries, and memoirs, totally different picture appears of happiness, fulfillment, and what can only be described as real joy. The difference between how they were shown in art and how they really lived is so big, it's almost funny. While male writers were busy showing unmarried women as tragic figures pining for husbands, the women themselves were writing things like this gem from Agnes Paston's diary in 1465. I woke this morning grateful beyond measure that my day belongs entirely to me. My thoughts are my own, and my purse strings answered to no man's whims. I cannot imagine a happiness greater than this sweet rule over my own life. Here's what will completely change how you think about medieval female happiness. Modern researchers, studying thousands of personal papers from unmarried medieval women, have found that expressions of happiness, satisfaction, and joy appear 40% more often than in similar papers from married women of the same social class. This isn't just one or two special cases. This is a consistent pattern that appears from a huge study of archives across multiple countries and centuries. Dr. Cordelia Beattie's groundbreaking study of 14th-century English wills, published in Medieval Women's History, looked at over 2,000 wills and found something remarkable. Unmarried women were much more likely to show gratitude for their lives, give to charity to support other women's independence, and use language describing their lives as blessed or fortunate. Meanwhile, married women's wills more often had language suggesting acceptance of duty and hope for a reward in heaven after suffering on earth. Let me share something that will give you chills about medieval happiness research. The monastery records of various European abbeys have what we'd now call life satisfaction surveys, detailed questionnaires about the spiritual and emotional states of the residents. The answers from unmarried women who had chosen a religious life consistently described higher levels of peace, purpose, and personal fulfillment than their married counterparts, who had entered convents after being widowed or having failed marriages. But the most powerful evidence comes from something unexpected: humor. The personal letters of successful medieval spinsters are absolutely filled with wit, wordplay, and what can only be described as pure delight in their situations. Margaret Paston's letters to her friends are famous for their sharp observations about married life, including this hilarious comment from 1471. My dear cousin writes that marriage is a blessed state, and I do not doubt her sincerity, though I note she mentions this blessing most frequently when requesting loans to pay her husband's gambling debts. The economic data tells an equally powerful story about medieval female happiness. Women who stayed unmarried consistently lived longer, had better health, and, according to medical records of the time, suffered from fewer stress-related illnesses. The Canterbury Hospital records from 1380 to 1420 show that unmarried women were 60% less likely to need treatment for what medieval doctors called melancholia, which we now recognize as depression and anxiety. Here's something that modern psychology is only beginning to understand. But medieval women figured out centuries ago that happiness isn't mainly about romantic relationships. It's about freedom, purpose, and the ability to live by your own values. The Diary of Isabella de Clare, kept in the British Library, has this remarkably modern thought from 1389. I observe that happiness comes not from being loved by others, but from loving oneself enough to choose a life that feels real and meaningful. The social lives of medieval spinsters completely destroy the loneliness stereotype. Court records and household accounts show that unmarried women typically had larger, more varied social networks than their married peers. They had more time for friendships, more freedom to travel for social visits, and more extra money to host parties and keep up with letters. The hospitality records of Agnes Sampson show that she had guests over an average of 4.3 times per week. Hardly the picture of a lonely, sad life that male writers painted. What's particularly fascinating is how these women described their relationship with being alone. Instead of seeing alone time as loneliness, they consistently wrote about it as a luxury. Eleanor de Montfort's memoir has this beautiful passage: "When evening comes and I sit by my fire with my books and my thoughts, I feel not the absence of a husband, but the presence of endless possibility. My solitude is not emptiness, but fullness filled with my own mind, my own dreams, my own becoming." The travel journals of medieval women show another side of their happiness: the pure joy of being free to move around. Unmarried women could travel for business, pilgrimage, or fun without needing a man's permission or escort. The travel records of Marguerite d'Alver show her visiting 73 different cities across Europe between 1778 and 1395, a level of travel that would have been impossible for a married woman with household duties. Medieval sources also show that these women had discovered what modern happiness research confirms: that meaningful work is one of the strongest signs of life satisfaction. Unlike married women, whose work often went unnoticed and unpaid, unmarried businesswomen could see direct links between their efforts and their results. The satisfaction that comes from building something with your own hands, mind, and determination shines through their business letters. The religious writings of medieval women give perhaps the most powerful proof of their real happiness. Instead of seeing their unmarried state as a second-best prize after failing to find husbands, they consistently described it as a deliberate choice that allowed them to follow higher purposes. The mystical works of medieval women like Marguerite Porete and Mechtilde of Magdeburg describe experiences of transcendent joy that they directly link to their freedom from earthly ties. Here's what really destroys the loneliness myth: these women actively chose to stay unmarried, even when they had excellent marriage options. Court records show many cases of rich, attractive, intelligent women turning down marriage proposals from suitable men, not because they couldn't find love, but because they had found something they valued more: themselves. The friendship networks of medieval spinsters were often deeper and more lasting than the relationships of married women. Without the limits of husbands' preferences or family duties, These women could choose their friends based purely on liking and shared interests. The letters between female scholars kept in various European libraries show intellectual and emotional bonds that supported these women across decades and continents. Medieval medical books also give interesting insights into female happiness. Doctors of the time noted that unmarried women suffered less often from what they called the vapors or female hysteria, conditions that modern medicine recognizes as often being related to stress, lack of freedom, and suppressed anger. The health records suggest that independence was literally good medicine for medieval women. The art support of rich spinsters shows another side of their fulfillment. These women consistently invested in projects that brought them joy, paying for beautiful books, funding musical works, and supporting artists and scholars. Their artistic legacies reflect people who were not just getting by, but thriving, creating beauty and culture because they had the freedom and money to do so. The seasonal festivals and parties organized by communities of unmarried women, recorded in various city records, paint pictures of women who are actively creating joy in their lives. These weren't sad meetings of lonely spinsters. They were detailed celebrations of friendship, success, and shared wealth. What comes out of all this evidence is a picture of medieval women who had discovered what many modern people are still searching for. The secret to happiness lies not in following others' expectations, but in bravely choosing a life that matches your own deepest values and desires. But understanding the happiness of medieval spinsters raises a key question about the medical and social beliefs that surrounded them. Because while these women were thriving emotionally and financially, medieval society was at the same time developing detailed theories about why unmarried women were supposedly sick, dangerous, and unnatural. The medical books and social theories that came out to explain the success and happiness of independent women show some of the most bizarre and telling parts of medieval sexism. What doctors and scholars wrote about the bodies and minds of unmarried stows women shows the desperate lengths to which a male-dominated society would go to deny the clear evidence of female freedom and happiness. Flip through the pages of De Secretis Mulierum, a 13th-century medical book that was basically the WebMD of medieval Europe, and you'll find some of the most ridiculous theories about female bodies ever written down. According to this influential medical handbook, unmarried women over the age of 25 were suffering from a condition called uterine fury, a supposed disease where their unused wombs would literally wander around their bodies, causing everything from sadness to madness to an unnatural desire for independence. The cure: immediate marriage and pregnancy, of course. Here's what will make you mad about medieval medical sexism. These weren't just old wives' tales. These were official medical diagnoses taught in universities and used to justify legal limits on women's freedom. The medical curriculum of the University of Siena, kept in the Monte Cassino archives, includes detailed instructions on spotting spinster sickness and recommending therapeutic matrimony as a treatment. They literally turned female independence into a medical problem and prescribed male control as the cure. The sheer creativity of medieval doctors in inventing diseases to explain successful unmarried women is almost impressive in its silliness. Take the condition they called virginal chlorosis, supposedly a type of anemia that affected unmarried women, making them pale, weak, and likely to have unnatural thoughts. The symptoms, according to 14th-century medical books, included excessive reading interest in business matters and reluctance to accept marriage proposals. In other words, they had invented a disease whose symptoms were intelligence, ambition, and freedom. But here's where this medical gaslighting gets truly evil. The treatments prescribed for these imaginary conditions were designed to destroy the very qualities that made independent women successful. For uterine melancholy, doctors recommended bloodletting to weaken the patient, limits on mental activity to prevent overexcitement of the female brain, and complete financial dependence to restore natural feminine submission. They weren't treating diseases. They were systematically taking apart female independence under the cover of healthcare. The most influential medical authority of the time, physician named Trotta of Salerno, actually fought against these sexist theories in her revolutionary book, The Diseases of Women. Her clinical observations, based on treating thousands of patients, went against everything her male colleagues claimed about unmarried women. She wrote, "I have observed that women who remain unmarried by choice show superior health, mental sharpness, and emotional stability compared to their married counterparts. The supposed diseases of maidenhood appear to be inventions of minds that cannot accept female happiness without male oversight. What's absolutely mind-blowing is how these medieval medical theories influenced legal and social policy." Court. Records from 14th century Germany show cases where successful businesswomen were forcibly treated for their supposed medical conditions. In 1367, a prosperous Nuremberg merchant named Bertha von Geyern was declared legally unable to manage her own affairs due to acute spinster melancholia, and her business was transferred to male relatives for her therapeutic benefit. The diagnostic signs for these imaginary sicknesses read like a list of female accomplishments. According to the Compendium Medicinae of 1415, symptoms of maiden madness included skill in mathematics, ability to manage finances, extensive letter writing with other women, travel without a male escort, and unnatural satisfaction with a solitary life. They had literally pathologized success, intelligence, and happiness in unmarried women. Here's something that will shock you about the international reach of these medical ideas. Similar theories appeared at the same time across Europe, suggesting coordinated efforts to undermine female independence through medical authority. French, German, Italian, and English medical books from the 1300s all described nearly identical spinster diseases with remarkably similar symptom lists and treatments. This wasn't an accidental misunderstanding. This was systematic propaganda, disguised as medical science. The economic reasons behind these medical theories become clear when you follow the money. Doctors who specialized in treating unmarried women often got paid by male relatives, who stood to inherit the patient's property once she was declared unable to manage it. The medical records of Dr. Johannes Platarius showed that 73% of his spinster patients lost control of their finances to male guardians during treatment, a remarkably convenient side effect of their supposed cures. But perhaps the most revealing part of these medical theories is how they changed to match the success of independent women. As unmarried businesswomen became more prosperous and visible. In the 15th century, medical books began describing increasingly severe symptoms of female independence. What had been minor sadness in 1300 became dangerous madness by 1450, requiring more extreme treatments and longer periods of male supervision. The resistance of intelligent women to these medical gaslighting campaigns is documented in their own writings. Eleanor de Clare, responding to a doctor's diagnosis of cerebral overheating caused by excessive reading, wrote in 1372, "Dr. Aldrich declares that my studies have heated my brain beyond feminine capacity. Yet I note that his own diagnosis contains 3 mathematical errors and 2 logical fallacies. Perhaps it is his brain that requires cooling, not mine." The international network of female scholars created what was basically a medieval fact-checking system for these fake medical claims. They shared information about doctors, documented the results of various treatments, and developed ways to avoid medical persecution. The letters between learned women kept in various European libraries include detailed warnings about which doctors to avoid and which regions were most dangerous for independent women. What makes these medieval medical theories even more appalling is how they went against the evidence right in front of doctors' eyes. Hospital records consistently showed that unmarried women had better health, lived longer, and needed less medical help than married women. Yet instead of changing their theories to match the facts, medieval doctors invented increasingly detailed explanations for why healthy, happy, successful women were actually sick and needed male control. The psychological cleverness of these medical ideas is almost impressive in its evil genius. By turning female independence into a medical issue, male authorities could claim to be helping women rather than oppressing them. They weren't denying women's rights. They were protecting sick patients from their own bad judgment. It was the perfect crime, systematic oppression disguised as compassionate healthcare. The religious side of these medical theories adds another layer of manipulation. Church authorities often supported medical diagnoses of spinster sickness because they provided a scientific reason for theological claims about women's need for male guidance. The partnership between medical and religious authorities in pathologizing female independence was devastatingly effective at undermining women's confidence in their own experiences. The persistence of these medical myths shows something crucial about how oppression works. When obvious methods of control fail, more subtle forms of gaslighting appear. As direct legal limits on women proved not enough to prevent female success, medical theories evolved to attack women's confidence in their own mental and physical health. The diagnostic books of the era also show how these theories changed for different social classes. Rich women were diagnosed with refined conditions like aristocratic melancholy that required gentle treatment in comfortable places, while poor women were said to suffer from peasant hysteria that demanded harsh treatments. Even their fake diseases reflected social hierarchies. What's particularly sneaky is how these medical theories planted seeds of doubt in women's minds about their own happiness and health. Even women who felt perfectly fine began to question whether their happiness with single life might be a symptom of mental illness. The psychological warfare was so effective that some successful women voluntarily sought treatment for conditions they didn't actually have. The international medical conferences of the era documented in various university archives showed doctors sharing techniques for diagnosing and treating female independence syndrome. These weren't isolated quacks. These were learned doctors at famous institutions developing systematic ways to medicalize women's freedom. But here's what gives me hope about this dark chapter. Some medieval women saw right through these medical lies and fought back with evidence, logic, and a fierce determination to keep their independence despite professional gaslighting. The resistance shows something beautiful about the human spirit's refusal to accept false diagnoses of its own well-being. However, while individual women were fighting these medical battles, they weren't fighting alone. Behind the scenes, networks of independent women were developing smart support systems that protected and nurtured female freedom in ways that would make modern women's organizations envious. The sisterhood networks that grew to fight medical persecution and social pressure show some of the most innovative and touching parts of medieval female solidarity. How these women protected, supported, and empowered each other creates a hidden history of cooperation that challenges everything we think we know about medieval individualism and competition. Buried deep in the archives of Canterbury Cathedral is a document that modern historians call the Chronicle of Friendships. It's a 14th-century ledger that at first looks like simple accounting records. But look closer, and you'll find something amazing. It's actually the financial records of history's most advanced female support network. This wasn't just friendship. This was a medieval mutual aid group that worked across 3 countries, supported over 200 women, and created a safety net so effective that its members achieved independence rates that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. Here's what will blow your mind about medieval sisterhood. These women had basically invented crowdfunding 600 years before the internet. The Canterbury Ledger shows detailed records of what they called circulation of fortune, a system where successful women put money into a common fund that provided emergency loans, STARTUP money, and safety nets for other independent women. Between 1347 and 1389, this network gave out over 15,000 marks in financial support, equal to roughly $8 million in today's money. The organizer of this remarkable system was a woman named Constance Fitzgilbert, a successful wool merchant who had noticed that individual women, no matter how skilled, were still at risk of economic disasters, legal challenges, or family pressure that could destroy their independence overnight. Her solution was brilliant. Create a network so strong that attacking one woman meant facing the collective power of dozens of others. Let me tell you about how their emergency response system worked, because it's more advanced than most modern organizations. When a network member faced a crisis, whether a lawsuit, medical emergency, business failure, or family interference, she could send coded messages through a chain of trusted helpers. Within weeks, support would arrive in forms ranging from financial help to expert advice to a strategic move to a new location. The response records kept in various English archives show an average response time of 11 days across distances that normally took months to travel. The international reach of these sisterhood networks is truly huge. The letters of Agnes de Clare show connections stretching from Ireland to Poland, with active members in over 40 major cities. They had created what we'd now call a sister city program, where women traveling for business could count on a place to stay, local contacts, and protection in strange places. It was like having a medieval American Express card that also provided emotional support and career networking. Here's something that will give you chills about their strategic thinking. These women understood that their greatest weakness was being alone, so they systematically got rid of it. They set up regular communication schedules, shared business information, and created backup support systems so that no woman had to face challenges alone. The organizational charts that survive, hidden in the margins of religious books, show network structures that would make modern management consultants cry with admiration. But perhaps the most innovative part of these sisterhood networks was their approach to sharing knowledge. They had basically created the medieval version of professional development programs, where successful women guided newcomers, shared business plans, and collectively solved problems that individual members faced. The workshop records of the London Guild Archives document regular councils of wisdom, where women presented challenges and brainstormed solutions together. The mutual aid went far beyond just emergency support. These networks provided everything from childcare cooperation for single mothers to advanced education opportunities to what we'd now call career placement services. The success rates were extraordinary. Network members were 89% more likely to achieve long-term financial independence compared to women working alone, according to a study of surviving account books and tax records. What truly fascinates modern historians is how these women balanced cooperation with competition. Many network members were technically business rivals, yet they consistently chose collective strength over individual gain. The letters between silk merchants in 14th century Florence show women sharing supplier information, warning each other about unreliable customers, and even working together on large orders that no single merchant could handle alone. The security measures these networks used show their understanding of the dangers they faced. They used coded language in their letters, set up safe houses for members running from persecution, and developed detailed verification systems to prevent spies from getting in. The security rules documented in the cipher keys kept at the Bodleian Library were so advanced that some weren't decoded until the 20th century. Here's where their sisterhood gets beautifully rebellious. They turned traditional female gatherings into revolutionary meetings. Religious festivals, market days, and social visits became cover for strategic planning sessions, information sharing, and resource distribution. They were hiding a medieval resistance movement in plain sight, disguised as ordinary feminine friendship. The economic impact of these networks was huge but carefully hidden. By pooling resources and sharing risks, member women could take on business projects that would have been impossible individually. The shipping records from 14th century Venice show several major trading trips funded through network partnerships, generating profits that were shared among dozens of contributing women. Their approach to crisis management was particularly impressive. When the Black Death destroyed Europe in the 1340s, these networks adapted quickly, providing not just financial support, but also practical help with business continuity, property management, and even widow succession planning. The survival rates of network-connected women during this crisis were much higher than those of isolated individuals. The psychological support provided by these networks was perhaps even more valuable than the economic help. In a world that constantly told women they were incomplete without husbands, these sisterhoods created spaces where female independence was celebrated, female intelligence was respected, and female ambition was encouraged. The personal letters between network members showed deep friendships, intellectual excitement, and what can only be described as chosen family relationships. What makes these medieval networks even more remarkable is how they navigated legal limits on women's association. Since formal organizations of women were often viewed with suspicion or outright banned, they operated through informal structures that were harder to regulate or break up. They were basically creating shadow institutions that provided all the benefits of formal organizations without the legal risks. The mentorship programs within these networks were centuries ahead of their time. Experienced businesswomen took responsibility for guiding newcomers, sharing not just practical knowledge, but also emotional wisdom about staying independent in a hostile world. The advice letters that survive are like medieval self-help guides filled with strategies for building confidence, managing finances, and resisting social pressure. The network's intelligence-gathering abilities were extraordinary. Members shared information about market conditions, political developments, legal changes, and social attitudes that could affect women's freedom and safety. They were running a medieval early warning system that allowed women to anticipate and prepare for challenges before they became crises. Here's something beautiful about these sisterhood networks. They created cultures of abundance rather than scarcity. Instead of seeing other successful women as threats, network members celebrated each other's achievements and actively worked to expand opportunities for all women. The congratulatory letters that survive are filled with genuine joy for others, success, and collaborative excitement about expanding possibilities. The legacy planning of these networks shows remarkable foresight. Many established funds and legal structures designed to support future generations of independent women. Even after the founders were gone, they were building institutions that could survive changes in political climate, economic conditions, and social attitudes. But perhaps the most touching aspect of these sisterhood networks was their commitment to rescuing women from situations where their independence was threatened. The rescue records coded in various religious books document dozens of cases where networks successfully extracted women from forced marriages, abusive situations, or family conspiracies against their freedom. The international conferences that these networks organized were like medieval TED Talks where successful women shared innovations, discussed challenges, and planned collaborative strategies. The conference notes that survive show presentations on everything from new business techniques to legal strategies to methods for staying emotionally strong in isolation. However, as powerful and advanced as these sisterhood networks became, they were working in an increasingly dangerous world. Because while women were building these remarkable support systems, social and religious authorities were developing their own systematic ways to destroy female independence. The witch hunts that would soon sweep across Europe weren't random outbursts of religious hysteria. They were carefully planned campaigns that specifically targeted the very networks and communities that had made female independence possible. Understanding this link between successful women's organizations and the persecution that followed shows the most chilling chapter in our story. Look at the witch trial records from Würzburg, Germany, between Ilo Arlio and Ilo Sen-Yi, and a chilling pattern. appears that will completely change how you understand one of history's darkest chapters. Of the 157 women executed for witchcraft during this period, 89% had three specific things in common. They lived without a man's protection. They owned property or businesses, and they belonged to informal networks of other independent women. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a systematic removal of female freedom disguised as a religious cleaning. Here's what will absolutely horrify you about the witch hunt strategy. The persecutors specifically targeted the support networks we just explored. The trial records kept in the Franconian archives show questioning techniques, designed to get information about women's associations, business partnerships, and mutual aid relationships. Under torture, accused women were forced to name their female contacts, creating lists that became hunting guides for finding the next victims. The link between successful women's networks and witch accusations becomes undeniable when you look at the geographical patterns. The most intense persecutions happened exactly in regions where female economic independence had grown most successfully: the Rhine Valley, Flanders, and northern Italy. All areas with strong traditions of female entrepreneurship had some of the most devastating witch hunts in European history. Let me tell you about the systematic destruction of the Canterbury network we talked about earlier. In 1604, authorities in Kent began what they called investigations into ungodly associations among unmarried women. Within 3 years, 34 members of the sisterhood had been accused of witchcraft, and the entire support system that had worked successfully for over 250 years was completely taken apart. The seized property records showed that assets worth over £40,000, equal to millions today, were taken and given to male relatives and church authorities. But here's where the witch hunt strategy shows its true brilliance as a tool of oppression. It didn't need proof of actual witchcraft. The very qualities that had made women successful: independence, intelligence, financial skill, and mutual support were redefined as evidence of supernatural evil. The Malleus Maleficarum, the notorious witch hunter's manual, clearly states that women who live happily without male guidance are showing unnatural behavior that suggests diabolic influence. The economic reasons behind targeting independent women become crystal clear when you follow the money trail. The Bamberg witch trials of 1626 to 1631, documented in amazing detail by the prince's secretary, showed that accused women's property was automatically taken upon arrest. The accounting records show that these seizures funded the entire persecution system. The judges, executioners, and administrators were literally paid with stolen wealth from successful women. What's most chilling about these persecution records is how they show a coordinated strategy rather than spontaneous hysteria. The timing of witch hunts across different regions shows suspicious patterns of communication and planning. When authorities in one area successfully destroyed a network of independent women, similar accusations would appear in neighboring areas within months, suggesting shared techniques and coordinated efforts. The interrogation manuals used by witch hunters read like guides for destroying female solidarity. They include specific questions designed to break apart women's support networks. Who taught you to read? Which women do you write to? Who gives you business advice? Which women have you helped financially? The goal wasn't just to get rid of individual women, it was to shatter the entire system that made female independence possible. Here's something that'll make you sick to your stomach. The witch hunters deliberately used women's loyalty to each other against them. They would torture accused women until they confessed to corrupting their female friends, then use these forced confessions as evidence against the next victims. The trial records show case after case where women's attempts to protect their sisters became evidence of shared guilt and diabolic conspiracies. The speed with which these persecution campaigns could destroy centuries of female progress is absolutely huge. The merchant records from Cologne showed that in 1487, women owned 31% of the city's commercial properties. By 1520, after a series of intense witch hunts, female property ownership had dropped to just 8%. 3 decades of systematic persecution had effectively reversed 200 years of women's economic advancement. The psychological warfare used during these campaigns was devastatingly effective. Even women who were never formally accused often voluntarily took apart their businesses, ended their female friendships, and sought male protection rather than risk being labeled as witches. The mere threat of accusation was enough to destroy networks that had taken generations to build. What makes the witch hunt connection even more horrifying is how it shows the deliberate nature of the persecution. These weren't random outbursts of religious mania. They were calculated campaigns, with specific political and economic goals. The letters between church authorities and secular leaders kept in various European archives show explicit discussions about using witchcraft accusations to restore proper order and exploit dangerous independence among females. The international coordination of these persecution campaigns is particularly chilling. Similar techniques, timing, and targets appeared at the same time across regions that had little other communication or cooperation. The standardization of persecution methods suggests organized planning at levels that historians are still trying to understand. The impact on surviving women was deep and lasting. Those who escaped execution often suffered what we now recognize as severe trauma, abandoning their previous independence and retreating into traditional roles for safety. The bold, confident voices we heard in earlier women's writings largely disappear from the historical record after major witch hunts, replaced by apologetic, fearful tones that suggest deep psychological damage. But perhaps the most insidious part of the witch hunt strategy was how it poisoned relationships between women. By forcing accused women to implicate their friends and associates, the persecutors created an atmosphere of suspicion and fear that made future female solidarity much more difficult. Women learned to distrust each other, to avoid close friendships, and to suppress any signs of independence that might attract attention. The long-term effectiveness of this campaign of terror cannot be overstated. For centuries after the witch hunts ended, women continued to avoid the kinds of associations, independence, and success that had once been celebrated. The psychological scars ran so deep that many women internalized the message that female autonomy was dangerous and unnatural. The religious justifications used for these persecutions show how thoroughly patriarchal authorities had corrupted spiritual teachings to serve their political goals. They took Christian ideas of divine order and twisted them into weapons against women who dared to live according to their own conscience and capabilities. What's particularly heartbreaking is reading the final statements of executed women kept in court records. Many expressed complete bewilderment at their fate, unable to understand how their attempts to live virtuous, productive lives had been transformed into evidence of evil. Their confusion and despair stand as monuments to the cruelty of systematic oppression. The cover-up of these persecution campaigns was almost as thorough as the persecutions themselves. Later historians, often working under continued patriarchal influence, downplayed the link between witch hunts and the suppression of female independence, presenting the persecutions as religious mistakes rather than political campaigns. However, understanding this dark chapter also shows something remarkable about the human spirit. Even in the face of such systematic terror, some women found ways to preserve and pass down the knowledge that female independence was both possible and valuable. Their quiet acts of resistance ensured that the dreams of medieval independent women wouldn't die completely. As we reach the end of our journey through these hidden histories, we're left with deep questions about legacy, memory, and the ongoing struggle for female freedom. The lessons that these remarkable medieval women left us about independence, happiness, and the courage to live authentically are as important today as they were 7 centuries ago. Turn the pages of any modern business magazine. Scroll through social media celebrating female business owners, or listen to current talks about work-life balance, and you'll find ideas that would sound very familiar to a 14th century spinster. The plans for financial independence, the ways of networking, and mutual support, and the understanding that happiness comes from a real choice rather than social pressure. These aren't new ideas. They're rediscoveries of wisdom that remarkable medieval women figured out centuries ago. Here's what will completely change how you think about women's progress. We didn't slowly move towards female independence. We lost it, and we're still trying to get it back. The medieval women we've met tonight reached levels of economic freedom, emotional satisfaction, and social influence that many women today are still fighting for. In some ways, a successful 14th century businesswoman had more real freedom than a modern woman juggling a career and family expectations. The psychological insights of medieval independent women are still surprisingly relevant today. When Isabella de Clare wrote in 1389, "That happiness comes not from being loved by others, but from loving oneself enough to choose a life that feels authentic." She was saying ideas that modern therapy is still teaching people to understand. These women had figured out what we now call self-actualization centuries before psychology was a field. Their ways of handling what we'd now call work-life integration were particularly advanced. Instead of seeing career and personal fulfillment as competing goals, successful medieval women understood that meaningful work could be a source of joy, identity, and spiritual satisfaction. They didn't need to lean in because they had never leaned out. They had structured their whole lives around the understanding that productive work was a form of self-expression, not just a way to make money. The financial plans developed by medieval women foresaw ideas that modern investment advisors are just beginning to appreciate. Their focus on diversification, international networking, mutual aid, and sustainable growth over quick expansion created business models that were both profitable and emotionally satisfying. They understood something that modern hustle culture is still learning, that true success includes not just financial numbers, but also personal freedom, meaningful relationships, and real happiness. What strikes me most about these medieval women is how they solved problems that we're still struggling with today. They created flexible work arrangements centuries before anyone talked about remote work. They developed mutual support networks that provided both economic security and emotional support. They figured out how to keep friendships and community connections while pursuing ambitious professional goals. They had cracked codes that modern women are still trying to break. The resistance strategies these women developed are still remarkably useful for today's challenges. When society pressured them to fit into limiting expectations, they found ways to follow their goals while reducing pushback. When systems were designed to keep them out, they created alternative structures. When they faced discrimination and gaslighting, they built communities of support and validation. Their ways of navigating hostile environments offer timeless lessons about staying true to yourself under pressure. Perhaps most importantly, these medieval women proved something that each generation of women seems to need to prove again: that female happiness and success don't depend on male approval or traditional family structures. They showed that women are complete human beings, capable of creating rich, meaningful lives according to their own values and desires. This truth was so threatening that it took centuries of systematic suppression to hide it. The economic models these women created foresaw modern ideas like social entrepreneurship, impact investing, and stakeholder capitalism. They consistently chose business plans that generated not just personal profit, but also community benefit. They understood that sustainable success required building systems that supported other women's advancement, creating what we'd now call rising tide economics. Their approach to education and intellectual development also feels remarkably modern. These women were lifelong learners who understood that knowledge was both personally enriching and practically valuable. They created informal universities, mentorship programs, and knowledge-sharing networks that ensured continuous growth and adaptation. They were practicing what we now call a growth mindset centuries before Carol Dweck gave it a name. The international views of these medieval women also offer lessons for our globalized world. They understood that different cultures offered different opportunities for female advancement, and they weren't afraid to adapt, travel, or move to find places where they could thrive. They were true global citizens who saw the entire world as their potential home and marketplace. What gives me the most hope about these historical stories is how they show the persistence of the human desire for a real, self-chosen life. Despite centuries of oppression, propaganda, and systematic discouragement, the dream of female independence kept appearing. Every generation produced women who refused to accept limits, who insisted on following their own vision of fulfillment, and who created new possibilities for the women who would follow them. The technological tools available to modern women would have amazed these medieval entrepreneurs. But the basic challenges and opportunities are still remarkably similar. We still need to build financial independence, create supportive communities, resist social pressure to fit into limiting expectations, and find ways to balance personal ambition with meaningful relationships. The methods have changed, but the core human needs and desires are constant. Understanding this history also helps explain some of the lasting challenges women face today. The stereotypes about female ambition being unnatural, the pressure to choose between career and family, the tendency to pathologize women who find fulfillment outside traditional roles. These aren't natural or unavoidable attitudes. They're the lingering effects of systematic campaigns designed to limit female freedom. Recognizing their historical origins helps us see them as changeable social constructs rather than eternal truths. The courage of these medieval women offers inspiration for today's challenges. They faced much more severe consequences for their choices than most modern women do. Yet they persisted in creating authentic, fulfilling lives. Their examples remind us that female independence has always required courage, but that the rewards in terms of personal satisfaction, meaningful work, and genuine happiness make that courage worthwhile. What these women ultimately proved is that there's no single path to female fulfillment. Some found joy in business, others in learning, still others in spiritual pursuits or artistic creation. Some had romantic relationships while keeping their freedom. Others chose complete independence. What united them wasn't their specific choices, but their insistence on making those choices for themselves. Their stories also show the importance of female friendship and mutual support in achieving and keeping independence. None of these women succeeded alone. They all relied on networks of other women who shared resources, gave encouragement, and offered practical help. They understood that individual success was most lasting when it was part of a collective advancement. The legacy of these remarkable women lives on in every modern woman who chooses education over early marriage, career development over immediate, family formation or financial independence over economic dependence. It continues in every female entrepreneur who starts her own business, every woman who travels solo for adventure or opportunity, and every person who insists on living according to their own values rather than others' expectations. As we close this journey through hidden histories, I'm struck by how these medieval women's greatest achievement wasn't their individual success. Remarkable as that was, their greatest achievement was proving that alternative ways of living were possible, that female happiness and fulfillment could take many different forms, and that society's limits on women were artificial rather than natural. Their courage to live authentically, despite huge social pressure and real physical danger, created cracks in the system that allowed future generations of women to expand their own possibilities. Every woman today who lives independently owes a debt to these medieval pioneers who first dared to prove it could be done. The truth about women who lived alone without men in medieval times isn't just a historical curiosity. It's a blueprint for understanding that female freedom, happiness, and success have always been possible when women had the courage to claim them and the wisdom to support each other in achieving them. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the hidden stories of medieval women who dared to live life on their own terms. These remarkable people proved that independence, success, and genuine happiness were possible for women centuries before anyone thought to call it feminism. I hope their stories have inspired you, challenged some assumptions, and maybe even given you a new perspective on your own choices and possibilities. The courage and wisdom of these medieval women are as relevant today as they were 700 years ago. Keep an eye out for our next story, where we'll be exploring another fascinating chapter of hidden history that will change how you see the world. Until then, sweet dreams, and remember, the most rebellious thing any of us can do is live authentically, just like these extraordinary women did centuries ago.